In a quiet English village, a forgotten fossil uncovers more than ancient bones. It reveals the timeless mystery of what it truly means to be human. Join Miss Marple as she unravels the first human, a story where truth, memory, and compassion intertwine like echoes from the past. Welcome to the series of Driftaway Tailies. Let's begin this scientific story. Chapter 1. The Reign over St. Mary Mead. It was one of those evenings when the air in St. Mary Mead seemed soaked in silver. The rain had been falling since tea time, not in torrents, but in that patient English drizzle that polishes every leaf and blurs the edges of cottages into watercolor. Inside the vicarage the lamps were lit early, and the smell of damp wool and coal smoke hung about the small sitting-room. Miss Marple sat close to the fire, a ball of pale blue yarn in her lap, listening to the ticking of the clock and the soft hiss of rain on glass. The vicar, a mild man with spectacles forever sliding down his nose, shuffled through a pile of correspondence. "Curious thing," he murmured, adjusting a paper in the lamplight. "A delivery from Oxford, of all places. Human Origins Department, it says here. I hadn't requested anything of the sort." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Oh, a parcel from a university museum? How learned we have become." "Yes," said the vicar, frowning mildly. "It arrived on the afternoon train. Young Mr. Cottle from the post office brought it round. The label says it's to be displayed at the parish hall next week, something to do with the exhibition Mrs. Anstruther has organized. Fossils and such." He rose and crossed to a wooden crate on the side table. It was about the size of a hat box, bound with rough twine, and bearing the dusty marks of travel. He prized open the lid carefully, revealing straw and a small glass case within. Inside the case rested a smooth, grayish fragment of bone, part of a skull, perhaps, with the faint impression of ancient ridges along its curve. Beneath it a cream label read in neat black ink: "The first human, discovered 1899, Dorset coast." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. How very precise and rather dramatic wording for Oxford. The vicar smiled, half embarrassed. "Yes, it does sound rather biblical, doesn't it? I shall take it to the hall in the morning. Mrs. Anstruther will know what to do with it." But Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the label. "You see, my dear vicar, that style of ink, the deep bluish-black, went out before the war. Most university clerks use carbon now. And the handwriting—" she paused, tilting her head. "It's a woman's hand, small, consistent loops, quite firm. You don't see that much in institutional labels." He chuckled. "Trust you to notice the handwriting before the fossil." "Oh, fossils never lie," she said gently, "but handwriting sometimes does." Outside the rain tapped steadily, the sound like distant footsteps across centuries. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, though her mind had already begun to stitch something else, a pattern of small curiosities, the parcel no one ordered, the label written in an old-fashioned hand, and the faintly theatrical phrase, "the first human." When she finally rose to leave, she wrapped her scarf carefully around her neck and peered into the night. "You will keep it locked up, won't you?" she said, "until you know who sent it?" The vicar laughed softly. "My dear Miss Marple, it's hardly the crown jewels." "No," she replied, smiling faintly, "but sometimes the smallest stones cause the biggest ripples." The next morning brought a pale, dripping sunlight over the village. Mrs. Anstruther herself came to collect the fossil, wrapped neatly in linen and placed in a wicker basket. She was a woman of rigid posture and delicate perfume, known for organizing charity teas with military precision. "So thoughtful of Oxford," she said briskly. "I did mention to Dr. Lively that our exhibition could do with something of significance." "How splendid of them to oblige." "Dr. Lively?" the vicar asked. "The young paleontologist who's been lecturing at the museum. A bright man, if a touch dramatic. He believes this fragment could date back 500,000 years. Imagine. Though, of course, I dare say we all came from Adam and Eve just the same." Miss Marple, who had dropped by to return a borrowed gardening book, murmured pleasantly, "Indeed. Though some of us perhaps arrived by a slower train." Mrs. Anstruther gave her a faintly puzzled look before sweeping out, basket in hand, her umbrella angled like a general's sword. When the door closed, the vicar turned to Miss Marple with a sigh. "You see, it's all perfectly innocent." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "No doubt. But I wonder who addressed the parcel, then, Dr. Lively or Mrs. Anstruther? Does it matter?" "Oh, in itself, no," she said, looping her scarf with care. "But I find that when one small thing is slightly out of place, others often follow. That evening, the exhibition's volunteers gathered at the parish hall. The long wooden tables gleamed with polished glass cases, ammonites, arrowheads, and the humble fossil now resting at the center, its label facing outward. A few villagers murmured respectfully as they passed, more impressed by the gold lettering on the title card than by the fragment itself. Dr. Lively, tall and sharply dressed, spoke to the vicar about prehistoric layers and sedimentary marvels. His enthusiasm seemed genuine, but Miss Marple, standing quietly by the tea urn, noticed how often his eyes flicked toward Mrs. Anstruther, as if awaiting her approval. "Fine thing, isn't it?" said old Mr. Cobb, the station master, adjusting his cap. "Came in right on time, too. Strange, though, there wasn't no Oxford parcel on my register Monday." "No?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "No, ma'am. Train from Oxford didn't run that day. Flooding on the line, you see. But I suppose the postal lorry might have fetched it later." She smiled politely. "Yes, perhaps later." Her eyes returned to the label. The ink shimmered faintly under lamplight, almost alive, and she wondered, as only Miss Marple could, whether the mystery was in the fossil or in the handwriting that named it. That night the rain returned. The village lay silent under its silver curtain, the street lamps reflected in puddles like small moons. Miss Marple sat by her window, the knitting abandoned beside her, and gazed into the garden where raindrops fell on the roses. Something about the day refused to settle. Perhaps it was Mrs. Anstruther's too quick confidence, or the way Dr. Lively had avoided her question about the parcel's timing. But mostly it was the label, that lovely, lonely bit of writing, confident and forgotten, as though it belonged to someone long gone. She took out her small notebook and wrote 3 short lines before extinguishing the lamp. Ink, pre-war, handwriting feminine, disciplined. Parcel, no official record. Then she added one final note beneath, almost like a prayer. Truth often travels under borrowed names. Outside, the wind sighed through the yew trees. Somewhere beyond the rain, the fossil slept, a quiet fragment of bone, waiting for someone to remember whose story it truly told. Chapter 2. The Exhibition at the Hall. Morning broke pale and slow, as if the sky itself were reluctant to open its eyes. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a hush that settled over St. Mary Mead like a held breath. Down at the village hall, a small group of women were busy polishing glass cases and arranging tables for the afternoon's exhibition. Banners of stiff paper reading "The Dawn of Man, from Fossil to Future" hung unevenly along the walls. The faint smell of paste and damp bunting drifted through the air. Miss Marple arrived with her usual unhurried grace, wrapped in her dove-gray coat and a hat decorated with a small velvet ribbon that had seen better days. She had promised to help with the tea arrangements, though in truth she had come because curiosity is a plant that grows best in fertile minds. At the far end of the hall, Mrs. Anstruther supervised everything with military vigor. "A bit more polish on that case, Elsie, and do make sure the lighting doesn't glare. We mustn't have people squinting." "Yes, ma'am," murmured the maid, rubbing diligently at the glass with a folded cloth. Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in the girl's hands. On the central table stood the exhibit everyone would soon be speaking of, the small skull fragment labeled "The First Human, discovered 1899, Dorset Coast." The glass gleamed, and the fossil within seemed almost to glow in the soft morning light. Miss Marple stood near the display, admiring its tidy arrangement. "So this is the famous relic," she said kindly. Mrs. Anstruther turned briskly. "Indeed, quite something for our humble parish, don't you think? Dr. Lively says it may be 500,000 years old. Extraordinary. The dear vicar is thrilled, though I do hope the crowd will not trample the carpets." Miss Marple smiled. One must always worry more for carpets than for eternity. By 3 o'clock the hall was bustling. The village turned out in its best clothes. Even the children from the grammar school filed in with polished shoes and whispered awe. Dr. Lively, in a dark blue suit and shiny shoes, stood at the front beside the fossil case. His hair had that deliberate untidiness that often passes for brilliance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice carrying easily through the hall, "what you see before you is more than a relic of stone and bone. It is a whisper from our very beginnings, the first flicker of humanity that once walked this earth." A murmur passed through the crowd. The words were poetic, perhaps too poetic. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the wall, noticed the vicar's polite nods and Mrs. Anstruther's approving smile. Dr. Lively gestured grandly toward the fossil. "Discovered, as the label says, on the Dorset coast in 1899, the very threshold of a new century, a time of faith and progress, of science and spirit united." From the side, Mr. Cobb, the station master, muttered, "Funny, that. My granddad worked the Dorset line that year. Don't recall no such discovery." Miss Marple heard him and filed the remark away in her tidy mental drawers. As the lecture went on, layers of rock, epochs of evolution, Miss Marple's eyes wandered. She saw Mrs. Anstruther standing with folded hands, gaze distant, the vicar nervously adjusting his spectacles, young Elsie hovering by the door, her apron damp from spilled tea. When the applause came, it sounded both polite and slightly uncertain, like rain on tin. Then came the local reporter, a thin man with an ink-stained cuff, eager for a closer look. "Beautiful script on that label," he said, bending near the tea. "Glass. Very old-fashioned. My mother writes just like that. A woman's hand, if I'm not mistaken." Mrs. Anstruther's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, perhaps. The museum staff are quite traditional, I suppose." The reporter scribbled a note. "Still, remarkable preservation." Ink hardly faded at all. The evening crowd thinned slowly. Volunteers cleared cups and saucers while children pressed noses to glass one last time before being ushered home. Outside, a damp wind rose over the green. Miss Marple lingered near the case as the hall emptied. She peered again at the label, the neat loop of the capital F, the gentle slope of the letters. She traced the reflection of her own face faintly mirrored in the glass, and the words whispered back at her, the first human. A small sound behind her, the soft scrape of a shoe. She turned to find Elsie clutching a tea tray. The girl's eyes darted nervously toward the door. "Beg pardon, ma'am," Elsie whispered, "but I thought you ought to see this." From beneath her tray she produced a scrap of stiff paper, torn irregularly along one edge. The ink upon it was the same bluish-black as the labels. The fragment read, "Veered 1902. Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. "Where did you find it, my dear?" "By the cat's dish at the vicarage," Elsie said. "This morning when I was sweeping. I think it's from that same label." Miss Marple accepted the torn piece carefully. The paper's texture, the slight cracking along the fibers. Yes, it was identical. And the ink? Oh yes, the same faded hue. "You've done quite right to show me," she said softly. "You mustn't mention this to anyone yet, Elsie nodded quickly, relief flooding her face. "Good girl. Run along now. And mind you keep your shoes by the fire. We can't have pneumonia added to mysteries." The girl curtsied awkwardly and hurried off, leaving Miss Marple alone once more with her thoughts. Outside, twilight had settled into a quiet blue. The lamplighter's steps echoed faintly along the cobblestones as he went from post to post. The vicar joined Miss Marple at the doorway, holding his hat against the chill wind. "Well, I think it all went rather splendidly," he said cheerfully. "Dr. Lively was very impressive, wasn't he?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, her eyes distant. "Quite impressive indeed. Though I do wonder how he explains two different discovery dates for the same fossil." The vicar blinked. "Two dates?" "Oh, nothing yet," she said lightly. "A little piece of paper turned up at the vicarage from the same label, I should think. It says 1902. Curious, isn't it? Perhaps a misprint." He chuckled uncertainly. "You and your clues, Miss Marple. You'd find a riddle in a grocery list." She smiled. "I once solved one in a laundry slip, you know." He laughed and offered her his arm as they walked back through the damp lanes toward the vicarage. The clouds above had parted, showing a pale crescent moon, and the village lay wrapped in that peculiar peace which often precedes revelation. Behind them, in the empty hall, the fossil lay under its lamp, a small, silent witness. The torn corner of its label, now missing, left a gap like an unhealed wound. And somewhere deep in Miss Marple's mind, the faint rustle of questions began, as steady and persistent as the rain that had washed the village clean the night before. By the time she reached home, she already had 3 neat notes written in her head. Ink, identical on both pieces. Original date possibly altered. Who benefits from an older discovery? She smiled faintly as she drew the curtains. Mysteries, she often thought, were like weeds in a country garden. Pull one up and 2 more appear before morning. And so, as the church bell tolled softly over the damp fields, Miss Marple set her kettle to boil and prepared herself for the long, quiet business of thinking. Chapter 3. The First Interview. The next day dawned with a curious brightness after the long spell of rain. The hedgerows glittered as if stitched with glass, and the air carried that clean, metallic scent that follows a good washing of the world. Miss Marple sat in her small parlor with a notebook open before her and a teacup cooling at her elbow. On the page were 3 tidy lines in her careful handwriting. Label, 2 versions. Ink, pre-war composition. Hand, feminine. Below she had added, almost as a moral observation, truth may be ancient, but deceit is rarely so old. There came a light knock at the door. It was the vicar, hat in hand, looking faintly apologetic. "I thought you might like to accompany me to the hall, Miss Marple. Dr. Lively has agreed to speak with us. There's been some confusion about the fossils documentation." She smiled pleasantly, as though she hadn't been expecting this all along. "I'd be delighted. It's always better to ask questions while the tea is still warm." The vicar looked a little puzzled, but offered his arm gallantly as they set out down the lane. The puddle still mirrored the morning light, and the air was filled with birdsong. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts were not on nature's beauty. They were on the small scrap of paper in her reticule, the torn corner that said 1902. The parish hall was quieter than before, the bunting now drooping like weary soldiers after parade. Dr. Lively stood at one of the tables, packing his specimens into their crates. His sleeves were rolled neatly to the elbow, and the faint scent of formaldehyde clung about him like a badge of profession. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said when they entered, with a smile that seemed just slightly too polished. "And the vicar, come to see the relics off?" "I'll have them sent to Oxford for cataloguing this afternoon." Miss Marple returned his smile with gentle calm. "How efficient of you, Doctor, though I understood the crate only just arrived from Oxford." He blinked. "Indeed, yes, it did. But one must document things twice over these days, regulations, you know." "Quite so," said the vicar amiably. "But there seems to be some mix-up about the date on the label." Miss Marple found a fragment with a different number. Dr. Lively's expression tightened. "Ah, that." He brushed an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve. "Probably a clerical mistake. The museum staff have been working in dreadful haste. And ink, as you know, can blur over the years." Miss Marple looked at him mildly. "Indeed it can, but not, I think, in 2 directions at once. One might fade, but it seldom changes from 2 to 9. The vicar gave a small cough, sensing undercurrents. "I'm sure there's a simple explanation," he murmured. "Of course," said Dr. Lively too quickly. "In any case, the fossil's authenticity is unquestionable. Its age has been confirmed by the museum. Now, if you'll excuse me, these cases must be—" "Forgive me," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "but when exactly did you request the specimen?" The vicar mentioned no correspondence. He hesitated, then smiled again, showing fine teeth. "It was all quite informal. Mrs. Anstruther arranged the matter through her contacts. I only supplied the description." "Ah," said Miss Marple, nodding. "Then the parcel was sent at her request, not yours. Well, jointly, you might say—" "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, "how often responsibility is shared just when clarity would be helpful." For a moment silence filled the room except for the ticking of the wall clock. Dr. Lively turned back to his crates, his motion slightly too brisk. Miss Marple watched the way his hands trembled faintly whenever he reached for the fossil case. When she and the vicar finally stepped outside, she said very gently, "He's protecting something, poor man." "Protecting?" You think he forged the label?" "Oh, no," said Miss Marple, eyes distant. "That sort of man would never lie for greed. But he might do so for pride or for someone's memory." That afternoon Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Anstruther. The great lady of the parish lived in a large house at the end of the High Street, full of good furniture and the faint aroma of lavender polish. She received Miss Marple in her drawing-room with the cordial stiffness of one who believes conversation a civic duty. "My dear Miss Marple," she began, "I suppose you've come about the exhibition. Quite a success, I thought, though one can't rely on Dr. Lively for punctuality. Always late, that man." "He did seem rather preoccupied," said Miss Marple. "Such a heavy burden to speak for the origins of mankind." Mrs. Anstruther gave a sharp laugh. "He does enjoy a grand stage. Still, one must admire ambition." Miss Marple's gaze wandered over the mantel, where stood an old photograph in a silver frame, an earnest young woman in Edwardian dress, holding what looked very like a fossil fragment. "What a lovely picture," she said softly. Mrs. Anstruther glanced over. "Oh, that an old friend of my mother's, Miss Agnes Lively. Brilliant woman, far ahead of her time. She helped catalogue early finds at Dorset, I believe. Died during the influenza, poor thing." Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. "Lively, you say? How interesting. A relation, perhaps, of our young doctor." "Yes, his grandmother, I think. He never speaks of her much." "I see," murmured Miss Marple. "And did she, by any chance, discover something rather important in her day?" Mrs. Anstruther's hand stilled on her teacup. "There was talk some small skull fragment, but she was a woman, you understand. The credit went elsewhere. I fear the world wasn't kind to such talents then." "Most unkind," said Miss Marple softly. "Time changes less than we like to think." Mrs. Anstruther smiled thinly. "Still, history sorts itself out eventually." "Sometimes," Miss Marple replied, "but sometimes it needs a nudge." Evening found her once more by her window, notebook open. The lamplight glowed against the fading blue outside. Facts so far. The label's handwriting, woman's. Mrs. Anstruther knew Agnes Lively. The doctor avoids mention of origin. Parcel date contradicts railway record. She drew a neat line under the list, then added one more observation. The living always edit the dead. The next knock at her door startled her slightly. It was Elsie again, damp-haired and nervous. "Beg pardon, ma'am. The vicar said to fetch you. There's something odd at the station." At the small railway office, Mr. Cobb greeted them with a lantern and an anxious expression. "Look here, Miss Marple. You asked t'other day about parcels from Oxford? Well, I checked the manifest proper. No record, not even for last week. But there is one outgoing parcel marked to Oxford Museum. Sent yesterday morning, Dr. Lively's handwriting clear as daylight." Miss Marple studied the entry. "So the crate that came never came, and the one that went perhaps never should have gone." Mr. Cobb frowned. "Meaning what, ma'am?" "Meaning," said Miss Marple gently, "that our mystery is a circle trying to pretend it's a straight line." She thanked him, bade good night, and walked home under a rising moon. The village was quiet again. The only sound was the distant hoot of an owl and the rustle of autumn leaves across the road. When she reached her gate, she paused, looking toward the faint light in the vicarage study, where the fossil still rested. "To alter the past," she murmured, "one need only change the handwriting." Then she smiled her small, knowing smile, went inside, and began to boil the kettle. For Miss Marple knew that tea, like truth, was best served after it had time to steep. Chapter 4. The Gentle Lies of Experts. The morning was bright but deceptive, that sharp kind of sunshine which glints coldly off the puddles and makes one believe spring has arrived when winter still waits around the corner. Miss Marple sat in her small sitting-room, the kettle humming faintly in the background. A letter from the Oxford Museum spread before her on the table. The letter, written in polite academic tones, confirmed what she had half suspected. No recent correspondence or shipment has been sent to St. Mary Mead Parish, all from our Human Origins Department. The final line, faintly indignant, read, "We should be obliged if you would return any specimen purporting to be ours." She folded it neatly. "So," she murmured, "the fossil came from nowhere official. That's rather like Eve without the garden." At 11, she set out for the vicarage. The lane was still wet and shining, and the smell of damp earth rose richly underfoot. The vicar received her in his study, full of books that leaned companionably against one another. "More confusion, I'm afraid," he said, handing her a cup of tea. "Dr. Lively insists it's a loan from Oxford, but they say no such thing exists." Miss Marple sipped delicately. "Then one of them must be mistaken, or telling a very polite untruth." The vicar looked troubled. "You don't suppose?" "Oh, I seldom suppose," she said lightly. "I only notice. And I've noticed Dr. Lively's handwriting is rather neat for a man who spends his life among bones. Neatness in men often conceals guilt or sentiment." He smiled uneasily. "Surely you don't think he forged the label?" "Not exactly. But I think he's polishing a memory that was never properly given its shine." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Dr. Lively's temporary study in the small cottage loaned by Mrs. Anstruther. It was a pleasant room, full of scattered papers and the faint tang of cigarette smoke. The doctor looked up from his microscope as she entered. "Ah, Miss Marple, come to see the great detective work of science, I hope?" "Only if the scientist is willing to be questioned," she said kindly. He laughed. "Good heavens, I'm at your mercy, then." "Do sit down." She took the armchair nearest the window, where the light fell clearly across the desk. On one corner rested a heavy leather-bound journal, the kind museums used before the war. Her eye, though seemingly idle, did not miss the embossed initials, A.L. "I'd been reading about your grandmother," she said casually. Mrs. Anstruther spoke of her with great admiration. Dr. Lively's smile flickered. "Yes, Agnes Lively. She did fine work for her time, though naturally her opportunities were limited. Limited by men, I expect." "By convention," he corrected carefully. "She catalogued fossils in Dorset, kept meticulous notes. Some say she made a discovery, but there's no record." "Perhaps there was," said Miss Marple softly, "but someone misfiled it." He hesitated, drumming his fingers on the table. "If you're implying I've invented something in her name—" "Oh, not invented. Revived, perhaps. A resurrection of the forgotten." She leaned forward, her voice gentle. "You see, I think the label is hers, or meant to be, and I think someone wanted the world to believe she finally received her due." For a long moment Dr. Lively said nothing. Then, in a quieter tone, "If you'd known her, you'd understand. She worked for recognition that never came. I thought, well, a symbolic gesture couldn't hurt." "Indeed?" Miss Marple said. but gestures like fossils sometimes harden into evidence. He sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead. It wasn't deceit, exactly. I copied her handwriting from an old letter. Mrs. Anstruther found the fossil in storage. We thought it fitting to present it under her name just once, to let her rest honored. I didn't expect Oxford to make enquiries." "Of course you didn't," Miss Marple replied kindly. "The dead rarely cause trouble until someone remembers them too vividly." When she left the cottage, the afternoon had dimmed. She walked a long way home through the meadow path, her thoughts steady and precise. It was not crime she had found, but something close. Vanity dressed as virtue. Dr. Lively had not meant harm, but truth once disturbed seldom settles easily again. At the edge of the green she met Elsie carrying a basket of clean linens. The girl's eyes were wide, and she hesitated before speaking. "Beg pardon, ma'am, but Mrs. Anstruther's been asking questions about you, whether you've been to see the doctor, and if you're planning to write to anyone." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then perhaps I shall save her the trouble and call on her tomorrow." Elsie looked anxious. "She's been ever so nervous lately. Keeps the curtains drawn, and won't let me dust the old cabinet. Says it's full of drafts." "Cabinets seldom draft without reason," said Miss Marple gently. "You've been most helpful, my dear." The girl blushed under the praise and hurried off. When Miss Marple reached her cottage, she paused at the gate, gazing up at the faint plume of smoke rising from Mrs. Anstruther's chimneys. "Yes," she murmured, "it's time the lady of refinement answered a few impolite questions." The next morning brought frost on the hedges and the faint chime of church bells. Miss Marple presented herself at Anstruther House precisely at 11, as good manners demanded. The maid showed her into the morning-room, where Mrs. Anstruther sat in a shawl before the fire, a silver tray of letters beside her. "My dear Miss Marple," she said coolly, "how kind of you to call. I hear the museum is most grateful for our exhibition." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, settling opposite, "though they seem a little uncertain about how their specimen came to travel." Mrs. Anstruther's fingers stilled. "Surely that's the museum's concern, not ours." "Oh, certainly," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "But I do find coincidences so intriguing. A fossil of human origin, a label written in the hand of your late lodger, and her grandson conveniently nearby to speak for it." The older woman's expression did not change, but her teacup rattled faintly as she set it down. "You make it sound quite melodramatic." "Life often is," Miss Marple said, "especially when it tries to tidy the past." Mrs. Anstruther rose, moving to the window. "If you imagine I intended deceit, you are mistaken. Agnes deserved her moment of credit. I merely allowed the possibility. And Dr. Lively?" "He was grateful," she said quietly. "He wished to honor her. We both did." Miss Marple's tone softened. "Then you have done so, though not quite in the way you hoped. You see, the truth is patient. It always waits for its name to be spoken again." There was silence then, long and delicate. At last Mrs. Anstruther turned back, her eyes glistening. "You will not make this public?" "My dear lady," Miss Marple said kindly, "the world hardly needs another scandal. But perhaps you might tell the museum the fossil was mislabeled, and that an error of sentiment has been corrected." Mrs. Anstruther nodded slowly. "You are very wise, Miss Marple." "Not wise," said Miss Marple, rising with her gentle smile, "only observant. It's much the same thing, but less dangerous." That evening, in her own sitting-room, Miss Marple watched the last light fade through the lace curtains. The fire murmured, and her notebook lay open once more. Findings. Label copied by Dr. Lively from letters of Agnes Lively. Fossil stored by Mrs. Anstruther for 40 years. Both acted from reverence, not deceit. Chapter 5. The Name That Wasn't There. The following morning arrived gray and cold, a thin mist draping itself over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead like a curtain unwilling to rise. The village seemed quieter than usual. Even the sparrows on the green chirped as though muffled. Miss Marple sat by her breakfast tray, gently buttering a slice of toast while her mind moved, as it often did, several steps ahead of her surroundings. The newspaper lay folded at her elbow. The front page bore a modest headline, "Local Exhibition Delights Visitors." A small photograph accompanied it. Dr. Lively, standing beside the fossil case, expression confident, but not at ease. The caption beneath read, "Human Origins Displayed at St. Mary Mead Parish Hall." She smiled faintly. "So we have achieved a kind of immortality," she murmured. "A photograph and a headline. That's all most reputations require." Before she could continue her breakfast, a soft knock came at the door. It was the postman, hat dripping from the morning fog. "Letter for you, miss," he said cheerfully, handing over a cream envelope. "Oxford postmark looks important." She thanked him, closed the door, and slit the envelope neatly with her butter knife. Inside was a brief note written in tight, professional script. "Dear Madam, in reference to your recent inquiry, the handwriting sample enclosed is confirmed to match that of Miss Agnes Lively, Assistant Cataloguer, 1898 to 1903. Miss Lively's notebooks remain archived under restricted access at the Bodleian Annex. Kindly note she was never credited with any official discovery, her last field record ending abruptly in 1902. Sincerely, Dr. H. Corbin, Department of Paleography, Oxford Museum. Miss Marple read the letter twice, her eyes softening at the final line. "Never credited," she repeated. "That does seem the heart of it, doesn't it?" She reached for her notebook and wrote in neat script, "Agnes Lively, confirmed handwriting. Date ends 1902. Discovery unacknowledged." Then, after a pause, "Who remembered her enough to send the fossil now?" The village that afternoon was all damp pavements and chimney smoke. Miss Marple walked toward the vicarage, her coat buttoned against the chill. The vicar greeted her at the door, papers in hand and a slightly worried expression. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, "you'll never guess Dr. Lively left for London this morning. No explanation, no note. Mrs. Anstruther says he took the early train." "How very hasty," she said softly. "And did he take anything with him?" "Only a small trunk. The fossil, however, remains here. I locked it in the vestry cupboard until matters are clearer." "Very wise," said Miss Marple. "And has anyone been to inquire about it?" He hesitated. "Well, yes, a young woman from the paper. Said she was following up on the exhibition. She asked for Dr. Lively's full name and credentials. I told her I'd have to check." "Good," Miss Marple said with satisfaction. "The fewer names in circulation just now, the better. Names can be terribly revealing." He looked puzzled. "How so?" She smiled gently. "Because, my dear vicar, sometimes the name that's missing tells you far more than the one that's written down." That evening, Miss Marple settled by her fire with her knitting untouched and the letter from Oxford beside her. The house was silent except for the occasional crackle of wood. She thought again of Agnes Lively, a woman clever enough to make discoveries, yet humble enough to be erased from history. The fossil had been hers once. Of that she was nearly certain. But it was not science that had brought it to St. Mary Mead. It was guilt, affection, and perhaps unfinished love. Her reflections were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Elsie, cheeks pink from the cold and eyes full of something she couldn't quite name. "Miss Marple, ma'am," she began breathlessly. "I was putting things right in the hall when I found this under one of the tables." She handed over a folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges. "I think it dropped from Dr. Lively's case." Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, written in slanted, elegant handwriting that matched the label's style exactly. "My dear boy, if ever the world grows kinder, perhaps one day they will allow my name to stand beside my work. If not, I trust that you, or someone like you, will remember that I tried to tell the truth even when it was inconvenient. With all affection." There was no date, but the paper was old, fragile as onion skin. Miss Marple felt a small, quiet ache beneath her ribs. She was speaking to him, she said softly, not as a grandmother, but as a kindred spirit, someone who hoped her truth might survive in another generation. Elsie frowned. "Do you think he forged it, ma'am?" "No," Miss Marple said, folding the letter reverently. "I think he kept it all his life, and then decided to let it speak for itself." The next morning was bright and brittle with frost. Miss Marple walked briskly to Anstruther House, where the butler looked surprised to see her. "Mrs. Anstruther's in the library, madam," he said uncertainly. Inside, the room was dim, despite the morning sun. Mrs. Anstruther sat at her desk, a small stack of documents before her. She looked up, face pale and drawn. "You've heard, I suppose. Dr. Lively's gone." "Yes," said Miss Marple, taking a seat. "And I've also received a letter from Oxford confirming something I think you already knew." Mrs. Anstruther's lips tightened. "Then you know Agnes discovered the fossil. I didn't wish to reopen old wounds." Miss Marple studied her quietly. "You hid the fossil after her death, didn't you? Out of guilt, perhaps, for not defending her claim?" A long pause. The older woman nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "My father was curator then. He told her the museum couldn't credit a woman." She wept. "I was a child, but I never forgot. When she died, I kept one specimen, hers, in secret. I couldn't bear to see it filed under another man's name." "And now," Miss Marple said gently, "you tried to return it through her grandson." Mrs. Anstruther's eyes glistened. "He wanted her honored. I wanted to unburden myself. Neither of us thought the truth would cause such confusion." Miss Marple reached across the table, her voice kind but firm. "Truth never confuses, my dear. It only rearranges what people prefer not to see." That evening, as dusk softened the outlines of the cottages, Miss Marple wrote in her notebook once more. Facts resolved. Handwriting confirmed Agnes Lively. Fossil, her genuine discovery. Label, restored by grandson using her original hand. Parcel, sent by Mrs. Anstruther to right a decades-old wrong. She underlined the last line, then added one more. Unresolved who wanted it displayed now and why. She looked up from the page, the faintest smile playing on her lips. "Ah, yes," she murmured, "the truth has a peculiar habit of surfacing precisely when someone hopes it won't." Outside, the mist began to rise again, curling through the hedgerows like pale smoke. In the vicarage, the fossils slept behind locked doors, and in the homes of St. Mary Mead, the lamps flickered one by one into being. And as Miss Marple poured herself a final cup of tea, she thought of Agnes Lively, a woman without a name in the records, yet remembered now in every whisper of the case. "Names vanish," she said softly, "but intentions linger. That, I think, is the first mark of being human." The clock chimed 9. She closed her notebook, folded her hands, and let the silence of the room settle around her like the calm after revelation. Chapter 6. Tea at the Museum Room. The morning mist lifted slowly from the roofs of St. Mary Mead, revealing a sky the color of old pewter. The rain had stopped, but the village still carried the scent of damp earth and chimney smoke. In the parish hall, the Dawn of Man exhibition had been taken down. Only a few tables remained, covered with dust cloths and forgotten labels. The fossil, now the quiet center of so much, whispered speculation, had been placed in the small side chamber the vicar jokingly called the museum room. Miss Marple arrived just as the vicar was preparing tea. "I do wish," he said, "that I'd never agreed to display the wretched thing. It's caused more confusion than the harvest raffle." "Confusion is the prelude to understanding," Miss Marple said, removing her gloves. "I should like to have another look at it, if you don't mind." He fetched the key reluctantly, leading her into the narrow room lined with parish archives and hymn books. The fossil case sat on a wooden stand, catching the dull light that filtered through the single high window. It looked different now, quieter somehow. Miss Marple studied the label beneath the glass. The handwriting still gleamed faintly blue, the date 1899 as bold as ever. But now she knew it had been written 40 years after that date, by hands that trembled with both reverence and guilt. "There's something touching about it," she murmured. "A lie told in the service of memory." The vicar sighed. "Do you think I should send it back to Oxford?" "Not yet," said Miss Marple. "Truth, like tea, is best when steeped a little longer." They returned to the vicar's study for tea. Through the open door came the sound of the church clock striking 10, each chime echoing with slow patience. "I suppose," said the vicar, "Dr. Lively meant no harm." "No harm," Miss Marple agreed. "Only a touch of vanity and a dash of filial devotion. Dangerous ingredients in the wrong recipe." She stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Still, I can't help wondering who posted the crate. The Oxford stamp was genuine. That required access, or at least someone who remembered where to find such things." The vicar frowned. "You think there's another person involved?" "Oh, quite certainly," said Miss Marple, eyes twinkling. "The truth, my dear vicar, is rarely content with 2 accomplices when 3 will do." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Anstruther. The housekeeper showed her into the morning room, where the lady of the house sat surrounded by papers. She looked tired but composed, the kind of composure that comes from years of running a household, and occasionally running from conscience. "Miss Marple," she said with a thin smile, "do come in. I was just riding to the museum to clarify matters." "How diligent of you," Miss Marple replied. "And will you tell them the whole truth?" Mrs. Anstruther hesitated. "As much as will satisfy propriety. They needn't know the family drama behind it." "But it's precisely the drama that explains the thing," Miss Marple said gently. "Without it, they'll only imagine mischief where there was none." Mrs. Anstruther gave a small sigh. "You are relentless, Miss Marple." Very well, I shall tell them that the fossil was Annez's discovery, that I preserved it, and that her grandson merely wished to see her acknowledged. I shall omit the decorative details of the label." Miss Marple smiled approvingly. A tidy compromise. Truth in outline, modesty in detail. I should think Agnes would approve. At that, something softened in Mrs. Anstruther's expression. She was remarkable, you know, not just clever, kind. She spent her last years cataloguing shells by candlelight in the garden shed. I used to bring her tea and listen to her talk of time as if it were a living thing. Perhaps to her it was, Miss Marple said. And perhaps, in her quiet way, she knew that the past never truly dies. It only waits for someone to listen again. For a while they sat in companionable silence. Outside, the wind rustled the ivy along the windows. Then Mrs. Anstruther said softly, "You'll keep my part in this private."
"My dear lady," Miss Marple said with her faintest smile, "privacy is the least we can offer the dead, and sometimes the living too."
The next day brought an unexpected visitor, a man from Oxford arriving by the midday train. His name was Mr. Hargreaves, assistant curator of the museum's Human Origins department. He appeared at the vicarage door, carrying a leather satchel and an expression of polite disapproval. "I've come," he announced, "to retrieve a specimen which, it seems, was lent without authorization." The vicar looked alarmed. "Oh, dear. I assure you, sir, we meant no harm." Miss Marple entered just then, serene as a schoolmistress entering a classroom. "Perhaps I can be of help, Mr. Hargreaves. You see, we have been conducting a small investigation of our own." "Investigation?" he repeated, frowning. She explained, briefly but clearly, the sequence of events, the crate, the forged label, the rediscovered fossil, and the noble if misguided intentions behind it. Mr. Hargreaves listened with increasing interest. When she finished, he said quietly, "Agnes Lively, you say? Good heavens, I've seen her name in our forgotten catalogues. There was a missing entry, human cranial fragment, Dorset, 1902. The page had been torn out of the index." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Then perhaps it was never truly lost, only waiting for the right reader." He nodded slowly. "I see now. I'll have the specimen properly restored and entered under her name. The truth, after all, is what the record exists for." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How refreshing to hear an expert say so." The vicar beamed with relief. "Then all is well?" "Quite," said Hargreaves, packing the fossil carefully. "Though I confess this is the most peculiar recovery of an artifact I've ever encountered. Detective work more than archaeology." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Both professions, I find, deal chiefly in the dust of the past." That evening the parish hall was empty again, but the lamps had been lit for a small gathering. Mrs. Anstruther, the vicar, and a few curious villagers sat quietly as Miss Marple read aloud a letter she had drafted for Oxford, a note of acknowledgment to accompany the fossil. To the curators of the Human Origins Department, this specimen, discovered by Miss Agnes Lively in Dorset, 1902, was preserved privately until such time as her work could be rightly credited. We return it, now not as contrition but as remembrance, a small act of justice delayed. When she finished, the vicar's voice trembled slightly. "That's beautiful, Miss Marple, so simple, yet so final." "Not final," she said softly. "Nothing that involves truth ever is. It only rests between discoveries." Mrs. Anstruther dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. "You've given her back her name." Miss Marple smiled. Names are rather like fossils, don't you think? They endure only if someone takes the trouble to dig them up. The villagers murmured their approval, and for the first time in weeks the small room felt lighter, not haunted, but fulfilled. When everyone had gone, Miss Marple lingered for a moment, looking at the now empty stand where the fossil had rested. The lamplight gleamed faintly on the polished wood. She whispered almost to herself, "So ends one excavation of the heart." Later, back in her cottage, she wrote her final notes of the day. The fossil returned to rightful record. Agnes Lively restored by name, Mrs. Anstruther at peace. Dr. Lively, whereabouts uncertain. Then, after a pause, she added, "The living repair the past not with stones, but with truth spoken gently." Outside, the last light of dusk glimmered across the roof-tops, and somewhere, in the distance, a train whistle sounded, soft, lingering, as if the world itself were sighing with relief. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, her expression serene. Another mystery solved, another heart quietly mended. And in the hush that followed, she thought of Agnes Lively, no longer forgotten, but finally, after half a century, home. Chapter 7. The Timetable Trick. The morning after the fossil was sent back to Oxford dawned with a pale, hesitant sunlight, as though the weather itself were unsure if peace had truly returned to St. Mary Mead. Yet Miss Marple, whose instincts rarely rested, felt that the story's soil had not been fully turned. She sat in her small parlor, reviewing her notes one final time, and found one detail that still pricked her sense of order like a loose thread on fine lace. The train schedule. The crate had been said to arrive on the Monday train from Oxford, yet the station-master, Mr. Cobb, had clearly stated that no such train ran that day due to flooding. Even allowing for confusion, the discrepancy lingered like a smudge that refused to rub clean. "Nothing ever arrives before it departs," Miss Marple murmured to herself, "unless, of course, it never truly traveled." When the church clock struck 9, she put on her sensible coat and hat, took her small notebook, and walked toward the station. The morning air was brisk, carrying the faint scent of coal smoke from the yard. She found Mr. Cobb polishing the ticket window, as if it were a matter of national pride. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "I wonder if I might trouble you again about your train records." Mr. Cobb straightened at once. "Morning, Miss Marple. You can trouble me any day. Is this about that Oxford crate again? Nasty business, that. Glad it's gone back." "Indeed, but I should like to check something rather small. You said earlier that no Monday train came through from Oxford last week, yes?" "Right you are. Line flooded past Didcot, closed for repairs." "Then perhaps," she said gently, "you might tell me which train did come that day?" He scratched his head. "Only the one from Paddington, but that's a different route entirely. Stopped here around 6:30 in the evening." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And was there any cargo?" "Couple of small crates, one from London University, marked Mineral Studies, but those went on to Market Down." Her eyes brightened. "Market Down? And does our Dr. Lively have acquaintances there, I wonder?" Mr. Cobb blinked. "I wouldn't know, ma'am. But I did see him on the platform that very evening. Said he was expecting a visitor." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her umbrella. "Expecting, not sending. How interesting." She found Mrs. Anstruther that afternoon pacing her conservatory, a letter in her hand and distress written plainly upon her face. "My dear Miss Marple," she said before being asked, "there's been dreadful news. The fossil has gone missing." "Missing?" "The museum's courier reports it never arrived in Oxford. The crate was signed for at Market Down Junction, but disappeared before the transfer. I'm beside myself after all that trouble." Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her mind whirred quietly. "And when was it posted, exactly?" "2 days ago on the early train. Dr. Lively arranged the delivery, I believe." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Then we have come full circle. A fossil once found, then lost, and now lost again. History does so enjoy repeating itself." She placed her gloved hand gently over Mrs. Anstruther's. "You mustn't fret. Fossils are patient things. They endure mishandling better than most people. May I keep that letter?" "Of course," Mrs. Anstruther said weakly. "What do you intend to do?" "Why, what I always do," Miss Marple said, eyes twinkling. "Follow the timetable." That evening she called upon Mr. Cobb once more. The station master greeted her with mild surprise. "Back again, Miss Marple? Don't tell me there's been another mystery in that crate." "Not yet," she said, "but perhaps there will be if we do not look closely." She spread the museum's letter upon his counter. "This claims the parcel vanished after being signed for at Market Down, but the timing is curious. You see, the connecting train from St. Mary Mead to Market Down arrives before the London train that would have carried it onward, meaning the parcel could never have been transferred at all." Mr. Cobb frowned, running a calloused thumb down the printed timetable. "You're right, the goods train's delayed every Wednesday, so whoever signed for it could only have been someone here," finished Miss Marple softly. "Someone who wished the crate to vanish without leaving St. Mary Mead." He looked at her uneasily. "But who'd do such a thing?" Miss Marple smiled her small, knowing smile. "Perhaps the same person who first arranged its appearance." Before leaving, she asked to see the signature from the parcel log. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and unmistakably familiar. The precise loops and firm downstrokes of Agnes Lively. "Good heavens," whispered Mr. Cobb, "but she's been dead half a century." "Indeed?" said Miss Marple, folding the page neatly, "which makes it all the more remarkable that she continues to send and receive mail." The next day the vicar called at her cottage, flustered and red-faced. "Miss Marple, I hardly know how to tell you this. A crate, an empty crate, was discovered behind the churchyard wall early this morning. It bears the Oxford label, but nothing inside save straw and dust." "Excellent," said Miss Marple. "Excellent," he exclaimed, "but that means the fossil is quite safe, I suspect," she interrupted gently. "Hidden by someone who meant to protect it from scrutiny." He blinked. "Protect it? From whom?" "From the truth," said Miss Marple, "or rather from the consequences of the truth. You see, my dear vicar, there are some who believe that the past is safer when it cannot be re-examined. But fossils, like secrets, have a stubborn tendency to survive burial." That afternoon she walked again to the vicarage's museum room, now empty except for dust and a faint mark where the case had rested. There, on the window-sill, she noticed a small trail of black soot, identical to that found on the first crate weeks before. "Ah," she whispered, "our village blacksmith again." By evening she had assembled the threads neatly in her mind. She invited Mr. Cobb, the vicar, and Mrs. Anstruther to tea in her parlor. When the kettle whistled, she began in her mild schoolmistress tone. The crate was never truly missing. It was never sent to Oxford at all. The fossil was removed before it left the village and hidden somewhere nearby, likely in the old smithy where Dr. Lively once worked on a restoration exhibit. The soot on both crates confirms it. Mrs. Anstruther gasped. Then Dr. Lively? Yes, said Miss Marple, though not for profit. He feared the museum would dismiss the fossil as insignificant and bury his grandmother's name once more. So he faked the disappearance, hoping to keep it safe until her credit was publicly secured. Mr. Cobb shook his head. That's a strange sort of loyalty. Not strange at all, Miss Marple said softly. Men have hidden worse things for family pride and for love. The vicar leaned forward. So what shall we do? Nothing, she replied simply. Oxford believes it lost in transit. Let them. In a few months, when they open a new exhibit, Dr. Lively will reappear with the fossil in proper documentation, and Agnes Lively's name will finally be printed where it belongs. No one need suffer, and no truth need be denied. There was a gentle silence. Mrs. Anstruther dabbed her eyes. Mr. Cobb coughed into his handkerchief. The vicar poured more tea. Miss Marple smiled to herself, watching the steam rise like a soft ghost between them. You see, she said, it's all a matter of timing. Truth, like trains, may be delayed, but it always arrives in the end. That night, as the village lights dinned one by one, Miss Marple sat by her window, gazing out at the still street. Somewhere beyond the fields a faint glimmer moved, perhaps a lantern, perhaps the reflection of moonlight on glass. She imagined Dr. Lively, packing the fossil away in some safe corner, his heart lighter now that its secret had been shared by another who understood. She whispered half to herself, half to the quiet night. The first human learned to remember. The second learned to hide. But it is the third, the one who forgives, who becomes truly civilized. The clock struck 10. Miss Marple closed her notebook, content at last, and let the soft ticking of time fill the silence of the room. Chapter 8. The Confession of the Living. The following morning brought a shy, uncertain light over St. Mary Mead. The storm of rumor had died down, leaving behind that curious hush that follows a solved mystery, or one the villagers believe is solved. But Miss Marple, who trusted neither rumors nor appearances, sensed that something remained untold. The facts fit neatly enough, yet the heart of the matter, the motive, the human truth, still beat unseen beneath the surface. She spent her morning as she always did when thinking, with her knitting. Click, click, pause, click. Each loop a question, each knot a small deduction. By mid-morning she had made up her mind. Dr. Lively, she suspected, had not gone far. A man does not abandon both guilt and love in one breath. He had hidden the fossil and fled only far enough to escape immediate censure. She meant to find him, not to accuse, but to offer him what the law rarely gives, and only Miss Marple could, understanding. After a brief word with Mr. Cobb, who confirmed seeing the young doctor near the disused smithy 2 nights prior, Miss Marple put on her sturdy walking shoes and set off down the lane. The old smithy stood beyond the meadow, half sunk in ivy and nettles, its brick walls mottled by years of soot. A faint line of smoke curled from the chimney. Miss Marple smiled to herself. The guilty always forget that smoke has the bad habit of pointing home. She knocked lightly on the warped wooden door. A moment later it opened, and there stood Dr. Lively, pale, unshaven, and startled into politeness. "Miss Marple," he said, voice cracking slightly. I didn't expect." "No one ever expects a visit from Truth," she said cheerfully, stepping inside. The interior was dim but orderly. A small stove glowed faintly in the corner, and beside it stood a table cluttered with notebooks, brushes, and the unmistakable shape of the fossil, wrapped now in linen and resting in a wooden tray. Miss Marple glanced at it, then at the young man. "So," she said mildly, "the first human refuses to rest even in Oxford's vaults. I dare say it prefers local company." He gave a strained laugh and gestured for her to sit. "You've come to deliver me to the authorities, I suppose?" "My dear boy," she said, taking the offered chair, "I've no authority but common sense, and that is rarely illegal." He sat opposite her, rubbing his hands together. "I never meant for this to happen. I only wanted her name restored. You must understand she was denied everything, her discovery, her dignity, her place in the records. My father grew up ashamed of her eccentricities. He used to say she'd wasted her life on bones." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And you meant to unbury her?" "Yes. When Mrs. Anstruther told me she'd kept the fossil, it felt like Providence. I thought if I could display it with her handwriting, her date, perhaps the world would remember. But then the museum began asking questions. I panicked. I couldn't let them dismiss her again as a fraud. So you staged a disappearance," she said quietly. He nodded. "I told myself it was temporary. I'd hide the fossil, wait until Oxford acknowledged her existence, and then return it with proper credit. But when the crate went missing and the papers began to gossip, I realized I'd made her vanish all over again." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "You see, Dr. Lively, the dead seldom need redemption as much as the living do." He looked up sharply, eyes glistening. "You think me a fool." "Oh, no," she said. "Only human, which, in this case, is rather poetic." He leaned back, shoulders slumping, as though years had dropped upon them at once. "I've failed her," he murmured. "Even with the truth in my hands, I couldn't do her justice." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "You've done more than you know. You've made people ask who Agnes Lively was, and that is the beginning of remembrance. As for the fossil, I suggest you send it to Oxford anonymously. Let them catalogue it, study it, give it value. Names are not necessary for truth to endure." He frowned. "But isn't that what she wanted, her name restored?" "She wanted her work seen," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Names fade, but work remains. If you attach your name to her act of return, the world will know both. That is legacy enough for any woman or man." For a long time there was only the sound of the stove's low hum. Then Dr. Lively rose, unwrapped the fossil, and looked down at it with a trembling smile. "She used to tell me," he said quietly, "that every bone remembers sunlight." "Then let it see it once more," Miss Marple said, standing. "And then let it rest where it belongs." They walked together back toward the village, the fossil carefully wrapped in Dr. Lively's arms. The morning had brightened into a crisp gold, and children on their way home from school stopped to watch curiously. The sight of the young doctor and the elderly lady side by side, one burdened with bones and the other with wisdom, seemed to them faintly mythic, though they could not have said why. At the vicarage, Mrs. Anstruther awaited them with tea and visible relief. "Oh, thank heaven!" she cried. "You've found it, and him." Dr. Lively offered a sheepish smile. "I've made rather a fool of myself, Mrs. Anstruther. I should like to send the fossil back to Oxford, properly this time." The vicar, who had been pacing by the fireplace, stopped short. "Then all this confusion?" "A mistake born of good intentions," Miss Marple said briskly. "And as those are the most dangerous kind, we must forgive them quickly before they cause any further harm." Everyone laughed softly at that, the tension dissolving like sugar in tea. Dr. Lively unwrapped the fossil and set it gently upon the table. The sunlight from the window caught the pale ridges of bone, turning them to soft gold. Mrs. Anstruther's voice trembled. Agnes would be proud. Miss Marple nodded. "She already is." That evening, when the crate was once again sealed, this time truthfully labeled, and sent off on the correct train, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the sky darken into violet. The rhythmic puff of the departing engine carried faintly across the fields, mingling with the first notes of the church bell. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Confession obtained, motive, devotion not deceit. Fossil returned, honesty restored. Conclusion, the living confess not from fear, but from longing to be understood." Then, after a pause, she added a final reflection. "Perhaps the first human did not speak or reason or carve symbols, but confessed. To know guilt, to seek forgiveness, that is where our story truly began." She looked out toward the horizon, where the smoke of the train had already faded into twilight. And with that, Miss Marple folded her hands, content in the quiet satisfaction of a mystery resolved not by accusation, but by mercy. In the soft glow of her lamp, her knitting waited beside her chair, a small, homely comfort against the vast questions of time. She smiled to herself, whispering, "It is a very old world, and yet still learning to tell the truth." The clock struck 9, gentle as a heartbeat, and the little room fell into peace. Chapter 9. The Drawing-Room Revelation. The next afternoon the village gathered at the vicarage, drawn less by invitation and more by that irresistible current that carries English villagers toward the promise of a little explanation. Miss Marple had sent out discreet notes that morning, nothing dramatic, merely a request for tea and conversation. By 4 o'clock the drawing-room was filled, Mrs. Anstruther in her pale lilac shawl, the vicar nervously adjusting his spectacles, Mr. Cobb stationed near the window, and Dr. Lively sitting rather pale but composed, hands folded upon his knees. The fire crackled with polite restraint, the china cups clinked softly, and the air smelled faintly of lavender polish and baked scones. Miss Marple, presiding from her usual chair by the hearth, looked every inch the harmless old lady until she began to speak. "My dear friends," she said, "you must forgive me for bringing you together yet again, but it seemed only fair that the truth, all of it, should be known before gossip invents its own." Mrs. Anstruther gave a brittle laugh. "Gossip always improves upon truth, Miss Marple. I doubt you can compete." "Ah," said Miss Marple, smiling serenely, "but truth, like cream, eventually rises even in lukewarm tea." The vicar blinked. "Yes, quite. Ahem." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "I should like to begin where all mysteries begin, with something quite small. A label, written in a woman's hand on paper older than most of us here. It said the first human, discovered 1899, Dorset coast. That little label, you see, contained 3 kinds of deception, one of ink, one of time, and one of kindness. The room stilled. Even the fire seemed to hush its crackle. Dr. Lively, she continued, did not forge it for gain, nor Mrs. Anstruther for vanity. It was an act of devotion. The fossil belonged to Miss Agnes Lively, his grandmother, who discovered it in 1902, but was denied credit because she was a woman. When Mrs. Anstruther later found the specimen among her late father's effects, she kept it, a silent penance for her family's silence. Years later, she and the good doctor sought to restore the truth, but as so often happens, good intentions stumbled into untruth. Mrs. Anstruther bowed her head slightly. "You make it sound so simple." "Oh, not simple," Miss Marple said softly. "Simply human." Dr. Lively spoke for the first time, his voice low but steady. "I never meant to deceive the public. I thought if I could show her discovery as authentic, even symbolically, her name might be spoken again. When the museum began to inquire, I panicked. I feared they'd take it away, hide it, or deny her once more." Miss Marple nodded gently. "So you made it vanish before it could be taken, the crate switched at the station, the fossil hidden in the old smithy. But it was not a theft, only a delay. You wished to preserve what mattered most to her, the recognition of effort, not the object itself." Mr. Cobb coughed. "Well, ma'am, it gave us all a fright. Half the village thought we'd a gang of smugglers about." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Smugglers of memory, perhaps, though they rarely profit from the trade." The vicar looked from one face to another, astonished. "Then there was no crime?" "Only one," Miss Marple said. "The oldest of all, to confuse truth with ownership. It began long before fossils or museums. A man or a woman discovers something, and the world decides who gets the credit. The result is always the same. The finder is forgotten and the label remains." Mrs. Anstruther's voice trembled. "You mean I was part of that forgetting?" Miss Marple reached across the tea tray and touched her hand gently. "We all are at one time or another. It is the most ordinary of sins to let others write the record for us." Dr. Lively swallowed hard. "Then what shall I do now?" "Return the fossil, as you have done," she said, "and tell the truth quietly when asked. The rest will take care of itself." For a few moments the only sound was the faint hiss of the fire. Then the vicar cleared his throat. "You speak as if truth were a living thing, Miss Marple." "It is," she said, eyes distant. "It's rather like a plant. It grows in darkness, watered by secrets, until someone draws the curtains. And then, for all its fragility, it stands upright again." Mrs. Anstruther dabbed at her eyes. "Agnes was right to believe in it, wasn't she?" Miss Marple smiled. "Entirely. The only thing she misjudged was time. Truth takes the scenic route." Mr. Cobb chuckled. "That's true enough for our trains." Laughter rippled softly through the room, a small release of tension, like a sigh shared among friends. Miss Marple used the moment to refill cups and restore calm. Then she continued, her tone gentle but precise. "There remains only one unanswered question," she said. "Why now? Why did the fossil resurface after 40 years of quiet?" Dr. Lively looked down. "Because I found her letters," he admitted. "They'd been kept in an attic box, addressed to no one, written in despair. I couldn't bear the thought that her life had ended in silence." "And so," Miss Marple said, "you decided to let her speak again, even if you had to lend her your own voice." He nodded. "I thought it would heal something." "It has," she said softly. "Not only for her." Outside, twilight began to settle. a soft lavender haze beyond the curtained windows. The lamplight inside turned golden, warm as the promise of forgiveness. Miss Marple rose and stood beside the mantelpiece, the small figure of calm authority that had quietly untangled more hearts than crimes. "My friends," she said, "this little episode will fade soon enough from the newspapers. But before it does, let us remember what it truly revealed. The first, human, whoever they were, may have walked upright, but they also remembered. To remember is to claim what time tries to erase. That is the true discovery here." The vicar murmured a quiet amen. Mrs. Anstruther, still gazing into the fire, whispered, "Then she was right. She once said knowledge survives only through kindness." Miss Marple smiled. "And she has proved her theory, even from beyond the grave." Dr. Lively looked up, his eyes clear for the first time. "Then we are all absolved." "Absolved?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "No, my dear. Enlightened, which is far rarer." When the guests departed, the vicar lingered by the doorway, watching Miss Marple tidy the tea things with unhurried precision. "You always make it sound so simple," he said admiringly. "How do you manage it?" She looked at him over her spectacles, her voice mild and amused. "Because, my dear vicar, people are simple, though their lives are very complicated." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You make theology sound like detective work." "It often is," she replied. "Both are quests for the missing piece, and both end in forgiveness." Outside, the church bell tolled 6. Through the misted glass, Miss Marple could see the faint outline of the departing group. Mrs. Anstruther walking arm in arm with Dr. Lively, Mr. Cobb lighting his pipe, the vicar's shadow long and thoughtful across the lane. When they had vanished from view, she stood alone for a moment by the hearth, gazing into the dying fire. She thought of Agnes Lively, of the quiet courage of women who worked unseen, of the strange mercy that allows even deception to serve the cause of truth. Then, with a small, contented sigh, she murmured, "The bones of the past are never buried deep. They rise again, not to accuse, but to remind us what it means to be human." The coals gave a final, glowing sigh. Outside, the wind rustled through the churchyard yews, carrying with it the faintest echo of an old name, one that would not at last be forgotten. Chapter 10. The Reflection at Dusk. The days that followed were gentler ones for St. Mary Mead. The air itself seemed easier to breathe, the lanes brighter, as if the small village had exhaled after holding its breath too long. The newspapers soon forgot the story of the fossil's disappearance, moving on to fresher scandals in London. Yet for those who had been part of it, Mrs. Anstruther, the vicar, Dr. Lively, and Miss Marple most of all, the events left behind a quieter, deeper echo. Miss Marple noticed it everywhere. In the vicar's new sermons about honesty, in Mrs. Anstruther's softened tone when speaking to her maid, in the faint, relieved smile that crossed Dr. Lively's face each morning when he passed her gate. Something unseen had been repaired, though the repair itself could not be spoken of. On a mild afternoon, the vicar came to call. He found Miss Marple pruning her roses with calm precision. "It's a fine day for beginnings," he said. She smiled. "Indeed it is, though we seldom recognize them until they've already begun." He chuckled. "I've had a letter from Oxford. They've officially catalogued the fossil, and under Agnes Lively's name. Dr. Hargreaves wrote that her contribution will be mentioned in their next quarterly paper." Miss Marple set down her shears. Then our little investigation has reached its most civilized conclusion. A footnote. The vicar looked amused. You make it sound so modest. It is modest, she said gently, but so was she. They walked toward the gate together. The garden hummed faintly with bees, and the sunlight fell across the path like threads of gold. I imagine, said the vicar, Dr. Lively feels rather redeemed. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Redemption is not something one feels, my dear. It's something one accepts quietly, as one might accept a cup of tea after the storm has passed. That evening, Miss Marple attended a small supper at Anstruther House. Mrs. Anstruther had insisted upon hosting a simple meal, to mark an ending, or perhaps a new beginning. The dining room was candlelit, and the scent of roasted apples and cinnamon filled the air. Dr. Lively arrived punctually, freshly shaven and newly resolute, the unease of earlier weeks replaced by a calm dignity. When the meal began, he rose to make a short speech. My grandmother, he said, voice steady but tender, used to say that bones were just stories without words, and that one day someone would teach them to speak again. I suppose we've all been part of that translation. Mrs. Anstruther dabbed at her eyes. She would be proud, Edward. I hope so, he said. And grateful to you, Miss Marple, for reminding us that truth does not demand triumph, only patience. Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. I merely arranged the clues, my dear. Doctor, you and Mrs. Anstruther provided the humanity. The vicar lifted his glass. To Agnes Lively may her story remind us that history is best written in kindness. Glasses clinked. A soft, peaceful silence followed, the kind that belongs only to rooms where forgiveness has been granted. Outside, the wind stirred faintly in the yew trees, and the church bell tolled the quarter hour as if to bless the moment. Later, as the candles burned low, Mrs. Anstruther drew Miss Marple aside. You've been our conscience, my dear. I only wish I had your gift for clarity. Miss Marple smiled. My gift is only age, Mrs. Anstruther. It sharpens the eyes but softens the heart. The following morning brought one last errand. Dr. Lively had asked Miss Marple to accompany him to the railway station as he set off for Oxford, not in flight this time, but in peace. The station was almost empty, save for Mr. Cobb behind the ticket window and a few pigeons perched like silent travelers upon the rafters. A thin mist hung over the tracks, the kind that seems to pause time for a breath. Dr. Lively placed his small trunk on the platform. It's odd, he said, to think all of this began with a mistake. Most worthwhile things do, Miss Marple replied. Perfection rarely leads anywhere interesting. He laughed quietly. You're right, of course. I used to think discovery was about knowing more. Now I see it's about understanding better. She nodded approvingly. Precisely so. Knowledge gathers dust. Understanding endures. The whistle blew in the distance, soft and melancholy. He extended his hand. Goodbye, Miss Marple. You've done more than solve a mystery. You've given a woman her name back. She took his hand with quiet warmth. And you, my dear, have learned what every true scientist must, that discovery and compassion are simply two forms of the same curiosity. The train pulled in with a slow exhale of steam. As he boarded, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of the fossil crate among the luggage, securely labeled, perfectly ordinary, yet carrying a story far beyond its weight. When the train departed, she stood for a while on the platform, the mist curling around her like memory itself. That afternoon, The village returned to its gentle rhythms. Mrs. Anstruther took up her charitable committees again. The vicar prepared his sermon on humility, and Elsie resumed her cheerful gossip with the butcher's boy. St. Mary Mead was once more the quiet heart of England, though those who lived there might have sensed, without knowing why, that something invisible had changed. Miss Marple walked to the churchyard, her steps light and unhurried. The late sunlight lay in long bars across the grass, turning every stone into a pale mirror of the sky. She paused beside the old bench under the yew tree and sat down, resting her hands upon her cane. From her handbag she drew out a small envelope, a copy of Agnes Lively's final letter, which Dr. Lively had given her before leaving. She read it once more. "If ever the truth of my work is lost, let it be found by kindness, not by cleverness. Cleverness hides, but kindness reveals." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, my dear Agnes," she murmured. "It has been found exactly as you wished." The church bell tolled the hour, echoing across the fields. The world seemed very old and very young all at once, like a truth rediscovered after centuries of silence. When evening fell, Miss Marple lit her lamp and took her accustomed seat by the window. The room was quiet except for the ticking clock and a faint whisper of wind against the curtains. She opened her notebook for the final time and wrote. Case closed, though hearts seldom close so neatly. Motive: love disguised as deception. Lesson: the origin of humankind lies not in discovery, but in remembrance. She paused, then added one last line in delicate script. Perhaps the first human was not the one who stood upright, but the one who looked back. Setting the notebook aside, she poured herself a cup of tea and gazed out into the night. The stars hung low over the village, glittering like ancient fossils in the dark. Somewhere beyond them, she thought, perhaps Agnes Lively was, smiling, no longer lost, no longer forgotten, merely part of the great, endless remembering that connects all living souls. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her eyes soft with contentment. "So many bones," she whispered, "and all of them still telling stories." The fire settled to embers, the clock ticked on, and St. Mary Mead slept beneath its quiet sky, its mysteries for now at peace. I am glad to know that you are still here. Please like this video and subscribe the channel to be our companion in this journey of scientific tailies by Driftaway Tailies.